this group coming on your next slide you see is the Massachusetts Bay Company. Puritans, seeing what the Pilgrims had done, so in other words, non-separatist purifiers, seeing the Puritan experiment, or seeing the Pilgrim experiment, the separatist experiment in New England kind of getting off the ground, gave them the motivation not to get a charter from Virginia, but to petition the king for their own separate joint stock company charter, the Massachusetts Bay Company. Now, since it is a joint stock company, it's a for-profit enterprise, understand that the Puritans had to make a profit. They could come to set up the godly world if they wanted to, but they had to be economically viable in order to ensure the satisfaction of their stockholders. So it wasn't purely coming just for God, even though that was their central element in it. John Winthrop is going to lead this so-called Great Migration in the 1630s of some 10 to 20,000 Puritans over through the next decade to come to settle the rest of New England. As they settle, they'll eventually overwhelm the Pilgrim minority, and these colonies will ultimately merge later on down the road as the Pilgrim colony of Plymouth Rock gets absorbed and subsumed by this far larger Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, when John Winthrop comes, when John Winthrop arrives with his Puritan followers, the ones who don't want to separate but want to purify the church, they're hoping to set up something that's going to be very common in the American experience from here on out. Another linkage seed you're going to see. They want to set up what John Winthrop calls, in one of the most famous phrases of American history, the city on a hill. The city on a hill. It's a metaphor. In other words, John Winthrop did not really mean we want to build our city on an area of high elevation. What it was is if you're in the city on the hill and others are outside the city on the hill, to see the city on the hill, they've got to look up. In other words, it was an aspirational colony. He was saying we must build a model colony that the rest of the world will look up to. Because when you talk about the G's of gold, glory, and God, the Great Migration of the Puritans is very much for God. Even though they got to make the money, they're coming to build, what they see as man's last best hope at salvation. And John Winthrop puts this to the Puritans in no uncertain terms. Essentially, he tells them there's no pressure. It's just the salvation or damnation of all of mankind that's on the line in terms of whether we succeed or fail. No pressure, that's it. And so he says, what are we going to do? We need to work as a team, live together, work together, celebrate together, mourn together, make each other's successes and failures our own. So there's a major sense of community. And I can't stress enough for you the significance of this in terms of contrast with Virginia. What did we say about Virginia? Predominantly single, predominantly males, predominantly young males, impoverished young males, all in it for themselves. They were all looking out for me. On the other hand, what you had in Plymouth, or what you had in the Puritan colonies in Massachusetts Bay, it's almost like instant rice, just add water. You have instant community, just add land. The Puritans came in families and extended kinship generational groups with numerous trades and skills represented with their pastors, their ministers, their mothers, fathers, grandparents, parents. They came as a pre-made social set, a prefabricated social order that simply needed a territory to plant that seed in so it could germinate and grow. So you had from the get-go a far more stable colony in New England than you ever had in Virginia. And the freedmen in terms of governments, what was a freedman? A freedman was a white male member of the church. As a white male member of the church, you had a voice in local governance and local decisions and in local church policy. So if you were in this exclusive little group, it was an exceedingly democratic concept if you consider that most of the Anglo-Saxon world and the European world in general still believed in the divine right of kings and the notion of government being this absolute hierarchical top-down thing. It's a far more leveled out or egalitarian society. Now, in terms of these contrasts, lastly, English attitudes towards the Native Americans were somewhat different than we'd seen elsewhere, too. We talked about the first Thanksgiving, just very briefly mentioned it. Once the Native Americans had learned how to grow food on their own, or once the English, rather, had learned how to grow food on their own and sustain themselves, they essentially had no further use for the Native Americans. The Spanish, for their part, were going to enslave them, but if they didn't enslave them, they were also going to make them part of their permanent imperial culture, imperial subjects and citizens. There was even an intermarriage to a certain degree. The French also had intermarriage to a certain degree. The English are going to, beyond a few modest efforts at converting the Indians to Anglicanism, are largely going to see the Indians as savages that they either need to kill off or push further westward in their own way. So it's not an attitude of accommodation at all that the English are setting up in the New World, particularly in Virginia, but also in New England. On to the Spanish impact, and I've kind of transitioned segues toward this a little bit. The Spanish impact, the Spanish and French colonies had one thing in common that was different from the English colonies. The Spanish and French colonies were not corporate, they were imperial ventures from the get-go. They were property of the state, in other words. They were always property of the crown. They were nation-run enterprises. On the other hand, the English colonies began as private ventures. They were private corporate ventures, which is how they started out, with the king largely, the government largely, other than granting the charter for these colonies, doing very little. They had their charter, they were on their own, they were doing what they were doing. Within the Spanish colonies, there was clearly a social hierarchy. At the top, you had the pure-blooded Spanish, elites that were running the colonies. Further down, you had lower Spanish individuals in status and class and station. Then you would have various degrees of mixed race people within the Spanish Empire as a result of these marriages between the Spanish and the various classes of Spaniard, but also the Spanish and the various Native American groups that were there. So there certainly was intermarriage on a level that was essentially not, I won't say never, but hardly ever practiced to the same degree at all. There's not this integration in North America and the British colonies on any extent that's taking place down here. The Spanish made active efforts to convert the Native Americans to Catholicism. They saw that as being equally part of what they wanted to do to bring them in as imperial subjects in this social order. Disease, of course, we've mentioned at great length, has played its role in wiping out these populations, or at least reducing their abilities to resist and largely have to submit in many ways. Following on to your next slides, let's get more specific about North America. You see the Spanish set up in Florida as sort of a northern buffer, a northern outpost against English encroachment. They set up in St. Augustine, the oldest, longest inhabited settlement of European creation in the New World in 1565. Further up, as they consolidate their holdings in the west, consolidate holdings from Mexico City northward, they are also trying to put a shoulder on French encroachment. Notice how Florida and their Texas settlements are going to try to provide shoulders to what the French are doing, to kind of shoulder and limit off that potential expansion as each side's kind of trying to grab what they're trying to grab. And then as they head west towards California, they set up a handful of cities and missions, but they've got a very broad-based network. There's hundreds of towns and missions and educational institutions all combined in the New World south of the Red River. I believe, in fact, that the Spanish set up the first college, the first university in the New World, some 70, 80 years prior to Harvard ever being established up in New England. So they've established and integrated this new Spain as a truly imperial nation-state venture, truly imperial enterprise. Even though the Spanish were very deliberately trying to build and maintain an integrated empire, even intermarrying with Native Americans to a degree, these efforts did not go entirely unresisted by the indigenous peoples. In Santa Fe and surrounding areas, for instance, heavy-handed attempts by the Spanish to impose Catholicism on the pueblos of New Mexico led to open revolt in the region by 1680, which included the killing of both soldiers and priests and the complete collapse of Spanish rule in the region. Spain struggled to reestablish dominion in their New Mexico province then for the next 50 years. The French approach, for their part, the group that's trying to being shouldered in down here and also walled off by gradual English expansion of their colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, the French approach was one that was economically driven and dominated. The French sought active development of the fur trade, and they weren't really seeking the full kind of occupation with tens of thousands of settlers coming over and vast military forces, boots on the ground coming over that the Spanish did, or the simply tens of thousands of people coming over for religious reasons that the English did. So you had this sort of in-between thing, and as a social consequence, since you had a low population density within the green shaded areas of New France, the Indians and the French were going to collaborate far more simply because the French were going to need their help. They were going to integrate into their social order. And the French, in many ways, integrated into the Native American social order just as much as the Native Americans integrated into the French social order. And you weren't going to see the French be in a position to impose their religion or socioeconomic worldview or political worldview on the Native Americans. And so you saw a very different attitude of collaboration and cooperation amongst those of New France than you were ever going to see in New England, where the attitude was largely purge the Indian, expel the Indian, exterminate the Indian, or the Native American rather, and let's reorder these lands and reuse them in the way that they saw God intending them to be used. So to sum up today, we've talked about the Spanish-French, to work backwards. We talked about the French-Spanish and English experiences in terms of relationships with the Native American. But largely today, we are focusing on the English establishment. The establishment phase of English colonies are going to be long-lasting and permanent. These things started very small, but they were going to get much, much bigger. We're at the start of something very big. And notice now, as we end, we began with lesson 1 and lesson 2 talking at first up here, and then talking up here, down there, everywhere. We've ended lesson 1 talking about all of this. We've ended lesson 2. We're getting tighter and tighter in our focus as we start talking more and more and more about the North American landmass. And specifically heading towards lesson 3, we're going to talk about the Atlantic seaboard and the North American landmass. And I look forward to seeing you all again for lesson 3, and we'll pick it up from there.